Dia, pessoal. Bom dia a todas e todas.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome everyone to this seminar promoted by Abraji, the Brazilian Association of Investigative Journalism, supported by the U.S. Embassy in Brazil and with the British diplomatic mission in Brazil. My name is Marina Atoji. I am a project manager at Transparência Brazil. It's a pleasure to have you all here. Thank you very much for you all who have chosen to be here instead of the COVID Parliamentary Investigation Committee in Brazil. So it is always a way to celebrate democracy, to talk about access to information. It is a rule that has to do with a fundamental right. And the approval of our law, which the acronym is LEI in Portuguese, has only been possible with the support by Abraji and Transparência Brazil, especially supported by Fernando Rodrigues, journalist who's also a member of the council, and Claudio Abramo, former executive director of Transparência Brazil. We may not forget that today's topic is to say that the LAI, or the Right to Information law, is fundamental to the freedom of information. So, as it brings to light what many people prefer to hide, especially those in power. So, let me thank you all, the embassy, the British mission, to the support of this event, everyone here. It's a pleasure to have you all. Let us now have the drums roll. We are going to have each speaker to speak. And then after they all speak, we're going to have a Q&A session based on what you asked on the chat. If you want to go ahead and type your questions on the chat, be our guest. We're going to write down your questions and try and answer all of them in the Q&A. And why not have better people than to talk about the powerful combination between journalism and right to information law? We're going to start with Nate Johns. He's the director for the Washington Post director for access to information. He's like an oracle of the information requests. Together with the reporters, he defines the requests that have to be asked and he decides upon the requests or the tactics that we have to use in order to dribble the negative to information requests. So he's also helping with the Washington Post system, which groups the requests for information and the answers journalists will end up obtaining. Nate, welcome. It's wonderful to have you here. Please tell us more about your work and how you help with freedom of information in your work.
Hey, good morning. Thanks to Transparencia, thanks to Abraji. It is great to be here with you guys. Although I must say, I've never been to Brazil, so maybe next time we can do it in person. So I'd like to see your beautiful country. My name's Nate. I'm the FOIA director at the Washington Post, which if you love documents, if you love access to information, it's a little bit like being a child at Christmas every day, because every day we're getting these packages from the government and rip them open and see what documents we've won. So today, set my timer here. I will speak briefly about maybe 3 brief general points, and then we can go deeper during the questions. So first, I'll talk about a general overview of the law in the United States. Second, I'll talk about some of the problems and challenges that we face. And third, I'll talk about some possible solutions that we or countries that want to go beyond what the US has can do or has to do to have a stronger, better access to information law. So first, in the US, we have a federal freedom of information law, and that's the most famous. But that only covers the executive branch of the government. So that would mean the Department of State, the Department of Transportation, the Department of Labor, federal agencies. It does not cover the Congress. So Congress wrote the FOIA, but is not covered by it. And it does not cover the courts. Also, it does not cover the presidency itself, the office of the president, until 5 years after that president leaves office. In addition to that, once you have that tricky law figured out, there are also 50 different state laws. So there's a lot to learn about the US, and some of these state laws are much weaker than the federal law, but some are much stronger. So one tip I always tell my reporters is that if you can file under federal law and a state law, do both, because often states are faster and release more than the federal law. And then the last thing I'll say about the general outlook is that the federal law, there are, depending how you count, about 100 different agencies, federal agencies, and each one of those does FOIA their slightly own way. They have their own website. They have their own place where you have to submit the form. They have their own place where they post documents. So you also have to work around that and figure that out. Under the federal law, there are, in theory, 9 FOIA exemptions. Many of those are pretty similar to those you'll see around the world, such as the privacy exemption, such as the law enforcement exemption, such as the national security exemption. But there's 2 others I just want to flag for you guys. One is exemption 3, which is the statutory exemption, which means that in practice, Congress can write a law at any time that will create a new FOIA exemption. So what that really means is that instead of having 9 FOIA exemptions, according to the latest count, there's actually more than 300, because Congress is always passing laws to, in my opinion, sneak exemptions through. So for one example, the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, I would say, oh, okay, well, a lot of their information will be protected by the national security exemption. Well, yes, but also no. They also passed their own law saying they have a CIA exemption too. So instead of one that would work, national security, there are now 300 others that they can also use. So it's confusing, probably unnecessary. One bit of humor is that one congressman, people didn't even really know this until we looked deeply. Someone passed an exemption for protecting information about how to grow watermelons. So there are a lot of statutory exemptions. The other one I'll just mention briefly that is being abused more and more is exemption 5, particularly the part of it about deliberative process. And that the wording of that says that any inter or intra-agency communication, so if you think about that, that's pretty much any communication can be held as deliberative and withheld. There was an interesting ordeal a while ago. My work requested a history of the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba in the early 1960s from the CIA, a history. And the CIA could not withhold it under these classification exemption or even the CIA exemption. Those were too weak. You can't withhold history, but they used this deliberative process to still withhold that. It's a long story. We can talk more about it, but I would just flag that deliberative process is, people call it the withhold it because you want to exemption. So that's a big problem. But I'll give you another successful example. During COVID, this is just kind of how the process works. So during COVID, the US had a type of stimulus, the Small Business Administration, which is a federal agency to fight COVID, to fight the quarantine, gave out lots and lots and lots of money, I believe over $1 billion of small business loans. Probably a good, smart program. Now looking back, it probably worked and it probably helped the economy. But at the time, the Small Business Administration wanted to keep all of those loans secret. So at the Washington Post, we filed a FOIA request, Freedom of Information Act request, saying we want all of that loan information. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the Small Business Administration soon wrote us a letter saying, we'll give you nothing. So we wrote an appeal. They also denied the appeal. And then I'll talk about this next. We sued in federal court. We wrote a fairly small lawsuit, paid $400 filing fee, and told the judge why we think that this denial was breaking the law, why they used this confidential business exemption, and we had to explain why we thought that the law said they could not do it. And eventually we won. And the judge said, you must release everything and you must pay the journalist's attorney's fees. So thankfully now on the Washington Post website, we have a very large, good, snazzy, cool database of all of this loan information, which is now public. So that's one success story. Now I'll talk about some problems. There are two big problems. One I spoke about just a little bit ago, over redaction. I think over redaction or withholding of information, it's a problem in every country, I'm sure, not just in the US. But the way it's a tough problem. Nothing is more frustrating than when an agency withholds something that is in the public's interest, and that's subjective, but in my opinion, that should be released, and the agency somehow finds the power properly or improperly to withhold it. That's the biggest problem in the US, and I'll talk about some solutions a little bit. The other biggest problem, that probably is a problem everywhere, is this problem of delay. The oldest, I looked this up, there's now more information. The oldest pending FOIA request in the US is now old enough to get its driver's license. So it was filed over 16 years ago. So in the US, we have a FOIA request that has been waiting for 16 years. And I have to say it, I'm very thankful to my colleagues at the Department of State for putting this on, but they also have a FOIA request at the Department of State that is now 15 years old. So that's just to illustrate that delays are a huge problem. There are some ways to get around delays. You can do an appeal, you can file a lawsuit. I won't get too in the weeds on that, but big problem. The second, well, I'll mention one more, that's funding. Right now, according to the recent Department of Justice data that was just put out, the entire Freedom of Information Project, federal, across all of the federal agencies, gets less funding than the cost of one F-16 fighter jet. So no doubt the agencies are underfunded. And my friends in the agency will say, thank you, Nate, for saying that. But I also always make this point. Funding is not the only problem. Many of these agencies are very inefficient, inefficiently organized, bad front-facing computers and websites, bad internal websites. And the reason for these delays, the reason for the redactions, the reason for poor customer service is, yes, funding, but also often, and it's different by different agencies, a lack of having a good workflow. Let's see. Another problem, I already talked about it, over redaction. What can we do to fight that? You just have to be an aggressive FOIA requester and know the law, always appeal, sometimes go to court. So moving on, I'm wrapping up and we can talk about other stuff in the solutions or in the chat. But right now, finally, I'm going to talk about some possible solutions. One, the US does allow you to go to court to a judge, but I think what would be better, and I know that other countries here are going to talk about it, would be an internal ombudsperson, or I like to say the word a FOIA beat cop. That means a strong federal actor with support of the president or leader of the country that goes from agency to agency to agency saying, you have a FOIA request that's older than 16 years? What are you doing? What are you doing to fix this? How can we help you fix this? If you really need funds to fix this, here are funds. Or you withheld a history of the Bay of Pigs invasion? What are you thinking? Who did this? You maybe need to be moved aside and we will get a new person in that won't withhold this information. So there needs to be someone that cares about access to information with strong backing that goes to the other agencies and tells them, get in line. Finally, the last thing that other countries have that the US doesn't have is some type of public interest test. Right now, if something can be technically classified by an exemption, it can be hidden, even if the public interest is overwhelmingly for that information being out. Two quick notes on that. One, I know at least in text, Mexico has a provision saying that no human rights violation can be exempted with any FOIA exemption, as I understand it. I look forward to hearing from my colleagues about that in practice. The US does not. They have something much weaker. They say that the agency must demonstrate harm to withhold something. But what we see now is agencies have gotten very smart and they just use the same sentence over and over. My cat Ripley, they use the same sentence over and over saying, this will harm internal deliberations. They just copy, paste. So it is a rubber stamp. So some type of true public interest test is needed. But that said, I've said my negatives. So in conclusion, I'm the FOIA director. I've been doing FOIA for almost 15 years. I love FOIA. I think it's the crown jewel of American open government laws. In the USA, the government is actually pretty good at giving the public information that it wants to give. So think of COVID health information, for example, posting that. But why the Freedom of Information Act is so special, so great, is that it gives us, the public, a fighting chance to go and fight and win for the information that the United States government wants to keep secret. And that is why it's such a special law. And that's why we have to eternally work to reform it. And I look forward to hearing from my colleagues' experiences. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nate. Quite a constant work of love and hate, if you will. Love to reveal information and the hate of the denials and attempts to hide and all the exemptions that we hate so much. We also face these negative replies at the preparatory moments. Yeah, this is very much the case here. But thank you, by all means. Let us now invite Shyamlal Yadav. He's a great, if not the largest reference in the use of access to information or right to information, RTI. He's the senior editor in the investigative unit of the Indian Express. He's received several awards, including Lorenzo Natali, granted by the European Commission. Shyamlal, please come tell us what
Yeah,
you
so
revealed.
can you please start my PowerPoint? Yeah, can you please start my presentation? Yeah, thank you so much. I will tell you, in India, in fact, RTI Act was implemented in 2005. It was after a long struggle, which started in mid-70s when Honorable Supreme Court, they decided that right to information is part of right to freedom of speech and expression, which is given in the Constitution of India. But after 74, when the Supreme Court decided this, the act was finally, RTI Act was implemented in 2005. It was made effective on 12th October 2005. So, like earlier, it is told, I will not tell much about the act, but I will show some practical examples that if a journalist uses RTI, how he or she can make some changes in the system, how he can initiate some reforms in the system. So, in fact, our RTI Act is almost same. It had some exemptions. Those are basically intelligence agencies, but even intelligence agencies, they can't deny the information about human rights violations and corruption charges against their employees. So, and other like some cases under investigation, some personal matters, these are the exemptions given in the RTI Act. But the law itself says that the information which cannot be denied to the parliament, that cannot be denied under the RTI Act. So it's very simple. Filing is very simple. Just rupees 10 is RTI fee, and one single law we have. It was passed by the Indian Parliament. It is implemented in every government office which is substantially financed by the government. It is the definition. So it's not, it doesn't cover the private organizations, but every government office, starting from the President Secretariat, Prime Minister's office, all the executive, every state governments, means provincial governments, local bodies, Parliament, Supreme Court, High Courts, every government office is covered under the RTI. So I will tell you the latest example. In fact, first of all, I must tell you that I have so far filed more than 10,000 RTI applications in last 15 years. And it has been at least thrice that I filed in all the districts of India, around 700 districts we have. So when the act was implemented, I was working with the India Today Weekly magazine that time. Now I work in other organization. So that time only we decided that though RTI Act is for the Indian citizen, but as a journalist, we should use it for the investigative journalism. And it was in that background that I started. And I will show you some of the stories. Please move at this slide. In fact, with the outbreak of this, yes, this one. With the outbreak of this COVID-19, our Honorable Prime Minister, he created a trust. It is called PM Cares Fund. And trustees are our Prime Minister, our Defense Minister, our Home Minister, but they said that it will not be covered under the RTI Act. So they are getting funds from every government office, even employees' salaries they have contributed, school children contributed, school teachers contributed, and they are getting funds from abroad also. But they said that it will not be covered under the RTI. So then PMO denied, Prime Minister's office denied. But what I did, I filed around 400 RTI applications to all the public sector undertakings, all the Indian universities, all the central government, federal government, ministries, departments, and all the state governments. And the result was that I got voluminous information that we published in 7 part this story. Like see the first one, first this story. We have some biggest public sector undertakings who spend 300, 400 crore CSR fund, corporate social responsibility. So see the last financial year was just 4 days after before this creation of this fund, and several PSUs, they contributed their almost all the CSR money into the PM Cares Fund. So that was the first story. Next, please. So we have number of these stories, step by step, like from the banks, how much from the public sector banks they got, how much they got from the armed forces. Links are given, and this slide, this PowerPoint will be shared with you after the webinar, so you can get an idea. So then the staff salary, then government staff salary, and the insurance companies, then top educational institutions, central universities, IITs and IIMs. So this was the whole story, and now everything is public, despite the fact that they said that it will not be made public. So the most of the funding we have already uncovered under the RTI. So next, please. So these are the stories which show that if RTI Act was not there, it was almost impossible to get the information. Like you all know that our Prime Minister was traveling abroad, number of countries earlier. Okay. So in every country, whenever he visited, he met 2 Indians there, and he requested to contribute in 3 funds in India. That was a cleanliness drive, that is called Swachh Bharat Course. Another was Clean Ganga Mission to clean river Ganga. And third one was the Bharat Ke Veer, which is a fund created by martyrs' families. So I got all the details of these funds and found that see the total contribution made by the by our non-resident Indians who are living abroad in US, UK, everywhere, and how much they are contributing. They are raising slogans there only, and they have contributed how much? Just see, it's 0.018% of the total contribution. So this was also under the RTI Act, and all three schemes we got exposed at the total funding, how much came from the NRIs. Next, please. Yeah, can you move ahead slide? Yeah, next one, please. Yeah, this is all covered. Yeah. Next. Yeah, see, this was a great story and it has huge impact. You know, the universities give honorary doctorates to specialist experts of the field. There are laws made for every university. So what I did, I filed around 700 RTI applications for this. So nearly 400 universities we have in the government sector. So I filed all the universities and deemed universities that to provide the list of the persons whom they have granted these honorary doctorates. So, and I was preparing an Excel file that whenever the information coming from any university, I was just making the Excel file. And finally, I got the data of around 2,000 personalities whom they have granted the honorary doctorates. And who were those persons? The University Grants Commission, which is a regulatory body of higher education, and their job is to monitor the functioning of the universities, and their office bearers, their chairman, their members, they were getting number of honorary doctorates from number of universities. And then I found there is one body, NAC, who are their mandate is to rank the universities about their performance. So NAC office bearers, number of their officials, they were getting the number of doctorates from the prominent central universities. So it was clear conflict of interest. Number of ministers, prime minister, president of India, who is visitor of same university, and he is getting again and again honorary doctorates. Then there are law universities and honorable judges of the Supreme Court and High Court, they are getting. So we published the whole list, and it was a great impact that after a few months, both these agencies, University Grants Commission and the NAC, they passed a resolution that members, their officials and their family members, they cannot receive any honorary doctorate when they are in job and after 1 year, till 1 year of their retirement. So this all was brought out only after the RTI Act, and highest number of RTI applications I have filed for this. It is around 700, and it took nearly 2 years, around 3 years to get all this information. Next, please. Next, can you please move the slide? Yeah, next one. It is covered already. Yeah. Yeah. See, this is a huge story, and you must have heard our Prime Minister. He speaks everywhere about this scheme. This is Dhan scheme, means to open the accounts of the persons who did not have bank accounts. Okay, the poor persons. So he launched a drive, and till now we have our banks have opened around 35 crore accounts, means 350 million accounts. Okay. So one officer, he one day told me that there is huge scandal going on. I said what? He indicated me, and after that I filed RTI applications to every bank. What was happening? Like if you are a bank manager, so if suppose 1,000 accounts are opened in your bank, so initially the pressure from the government was to open the government. But once the accounts were opened, then government pressurized them to make functional those accounts. Means those account holders must be asked to put some money in those accounts. But what they did, they tried to deposit their own money, means their pocket. They like if he has 1,000 accounts in his branch, he put his own 1,000 rupees and just deposited 1 rupee in each account, and suddenly all the accounts were functional. Okay, so it was a huge eyewash going on in the name of scheme. I just asked every bank that please tell me the total Jan Dhan accounts where total transaction, total deposit is rupee 1 with single transaction. Okay, so but for this story, simple data was not a story. So I traveled whole North India. I traveled several states. I interviewed the persons, some selective persons in whose accounts the rupee 1 was deposited. I interviewed that. They said that I don't know who deposited the amount. So finally, first day the government denied, but next day when they thought that I have sufficient stuff with me, our finance minister, who is no more now, Mr. Arun Jaitley, he held a press conference and he said that yes, there is wrong with some banks, and they constituted an inquiry, and finally they covered up. But at least some inquiry were there, and now they have initiated some reforms. Yeah, next please. Next please, next. Yeah, next, this is the word, yeah. Yeah, this, in fact, this, I have number of examples, but within time limit, I will show you some, and next, rest you can see in my presentation on your emails. So this was, in fact, first big story brought through the RTI. I got the foreign travel details of all the union ministers, federal government ministers of India. It was in 2008 sometimes. So first story, that time I was working with the magazine and I calculated all the mileage of ministers, and see, this was published a 15-page cover story of the magazine. That when I divided the total mileage covered by the ministers to circumference of the earth, it was 256 round, you can see. But it has huge impact. Please move next slide. Next, please move on. Yeah. Can you move? Yeah. After publishing that story, that time he was Prime Minister, our Prime Minister. He wrote a personal letter to every minister to curtail the foreign travel expenditure. That was an acceptance by the government that unnecessarily foreign travels are being made by the ministers. And I can tell you there is another story on foreign travel of bureaucrats. Both these stories were prompted the government to initiate massive austerity drive in foreign travel expenditure curtailment. Okay, next please. Next slide, please. Can you, yeah. This was on the foreign travel made by the bureaucrats, same duration. So both, yeah, next please. So both these stories made huge impact and prompted several austerity measures in India, which are still being implemented. And I can say that in current government, only our Prime Minister has traveled much, not other ministers. Next please. Yeah, after this story, that this was circular issued by our finance ministry that foreign travel, if a government official is making foreign travel and is getting frequent flyer mileage points, that cannot be used on the personal trip, because it was a big reason of unnecessarily foreign trips were made. Okay, next please. So this is also a great story. Our MPs, they are given 30,000 rupees to appoint a PA, personal assistant. So they can appoint number of persons on just rupees 30,000 in total. So I got the list from both houses of parliament, means upper house and lower house. We call it Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha. I got all the list of MPs. Then I made a simple call to every MP and asked them that, sir, who is the person who is working as a PA, your PA? So finally, I got the complete data and I found that number of father, son, daughter, wives, husbands, and if I found number of MPs who have 3 sons and all 3 are working as their PA. So his wife is working as PA. His 2 daughters are working as PA. His grandson is working as PA. Just to keep that personal assistance allowance in their home only. Okay. So after publishing this story, the upper house, there was no impact on the lower house, but upper house, our ethics committee of the upper house of parliament, they passed a resolution that members cannot appoint their close relatives as their personal assistant. So that was also an impact. Yeah, next, please. Next, please. Yes, then see, this is another classic example. In 1964, just imagine, 1964, our union cabinet, federal cabinet, they passed a resolution that every minister will declare their assets and liabilities to the prime minister. Okay, it was in 1964. And after 44 years of this resolution, in 2008, when I filed an RTI to Prime Minister's office and another office, High Office, Cabinet Secretariat, both offices, both of these offices, they forwarded my application to each other. And they told me that we are not concerned with your application. So both these offices, they were not even aware after 44 years that which is the concerned office to deal with. Filing the details, just forget that. So what I did, I filed each other's response to them and said that you please tell me, but you know that if such information is from office of the high offices of the government prime minister who is running the country, so just denial was also a news for me. So we published this both these letters scanned and this open secret. And I can tell you that after in 2009, when our government, Dr. Manmohan Singh's government again came to the power, that was the first government since 1964 where all the ministers declared their assets and liabilities. I can't say that corruption can be curtailed by these declarations, but these are just simple things which ministers were not even following, and these offices were not even aware of that fact that their cabinet has passed a resolution in 1964. So if RTI Act was not there, these things were very difficult to bring out. Okay, next, please. Yeah, next slide, please. Can you move this? Yeah. Should I finish? Okay, so 2 minutes. Okay. See, this is interception orders. You all know that governments can intercept our phones in the interest of national security. Okay. But there are certain norms. Indian Telegraph Act is there, and our Home Secretary is authorized to give approval to interception. But this was the figure, just see the figure, that 9,000 orders of interception every month means around 250 to 300 telephone interception orders are issued every day. Can you imagine? And Home Secretary himself gives approval. So if one file takes 2-3 minutes, so what other work he is able to do whole day? So I think he just disposes these requests of interceptions. Okay. Yeah. Next, please. Next, please. Yeah. Next, this you can see in the presentation. This is a story on river pollution for which I take 1 year and 40 applications. For this story, I have won many number of awards in India and abroad. It was selected by the UNESCO among the 20 best investigative pieces across the globe. It is published. It is available on the UNESCO websites. You can see that. So it was also under RTI. Next, please. Next. Yeah, I'm finishing. But next slide, please. Yeah. So what else I can say? Next, please move on. So the beauty of Indian RTI Act is that it has become like a lifeline in India government, though our government is also trying to weaken the law, but no politician can criticize the RTI law publicly. That is the impact it has at the ground level, and ordinary citizen, how much confidence they have got that our government, our ministers, our prime minister, our home minister, they may try to weaken it, but they can't criticize the RTI Act openly. It is the beauty of Indian RTI Act and how it has reached to the masses and how it has raised their confidence. Next, please. It's a finish now. Yeah. Next slide. Yeah, so you all must have seen this that UK Prime Minister who implemented the RTI Act, what he said about the RTI. But I just put this quote because in India it's not possible so far that any Prime Minister, our former Prime Minister, his government was most affected by the RTI. You have seen the stories, but even he takes credit now. He never criticized the RTI Act. So that all was from me, and I can answer your questions. And this presentation, it can be shared, please, to everybody, whoever wants to see. Thank you so much. Am I audible? Yeah.
Muito obrigada, Shyamlal. Sempre
Thank
prazer.
you, Shyamlal. It's always a pleasure to hear you. It's great to see that the RTI Act is always great to see that it's a dream come true. It's something that we're using to try to change realities that are wrong. And it's very great to see this quote from Tony Blair that you just showed us. Let's move on to Jen Bramley. She's a manager for partnerships in MySociety. It's an organization that potentializes civic participation through the use of technologies. Jen provides support to organizations and peoples in the use of tools through MySociety, through sites that simplify FOIA requests to the British government, and it allows people to browse through applications and responses. So it's a bit similar to actions that we take together in Brazil. Jen, tell us a bit more about your work, how MySociety works, and how it uses the FOIA.
Okay, let me just grab my presentation up. And now it's going to make it hard to share it because that's in the way. Okay. I'm going to need to go back. Okay, so I haven't actually got anything on what MySociety is. You did a pretty good job of explaining our mission anyway. We are a civic tech organization, I guess you'd call us. Our mission is predominantly to help citizens exert power over institutions. So we work in a lot of different areas. We work in democracy building. We work in freedom of information and transparency. We also work in kind of civic services. So we work in partnership with local government authorities and things like that in the UK to try and provide better public services to citizens. Tell me if I'm going too fast for the interpreter. The other thing that we do is a lot of research. So we have a whole stream of research which looks at the impacts of civic technology on like governments and on democracies and on transparency around the world. And we're one of the first organizations that's really made that research into a core stream of the work that we do. So I'm here to talk about freedom of information in the UK and a little bit beyond, because we have a platform, an open source code base called Alabatelli. And that code base powers freedom of information platforms in over 20 countries around the world. So not to jump ahead of myself, what do they know is the platform in the UK? It's basically a really simple website which allows you to search requests that have been made or make requests to government departments. it's super easy. You can actually start making a request before you even sign up for the platform. What we usually find is actually when people are browsing for information on Google, they'll be like typing in, for example, like how many school places were allocated this year in my borough. And they'll type that in, and then they'll find an FOI request on what do they know, which will provide them with the information. So they'll get a link back to the site. So that's where a lot of our site traffic actually comes from, because all of the requests are published publicly for non-journalist users of the platform. And that's a distinction I'll come back to in a second. So for example, this is an authority that we have within What Do They Know? Cardiff Council. It's a local council. And this shows, when you look at an authority page, you can find a list of all of the requests that have been made to that authority. So you can browse between dates, for example. You can look things up by keywords. And you can search the site. You can look at who's kind of following, what has been successful, what hasn't, what's still unresolved as well, which is kind of useful. So when we speak to journalists in the UK, they often say that if they haven't got a specific topic in mind for an investigation, they will sometimes just search keywords on, sorry, something can go off in the background. They'll search keywords on What Do They Know? And they will find like things that have been unresolved or things that they could follow up and kind of look at what's going on in the UK at the moment. So we have a pro version of the service, which is aimed at journalists and campaigners and researchers. This came into being about 3 years ago. We started working really in depth with journalists in the UK to build the service and to basically ensure that things that journalists needed to be able to make online FOI requests really powerful for them were included in the platform. So what the Pro service does is it allows you to make private requests. So at the moment, like I said, everything on What Do They Know, if you just have a normal account, is public. But requests, if you are a pro user, can be made private. You can set your privacy for 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, and we remind you when the privacy period is coming to an end. So you get a week with which to decide whether you want to release that data because you've released your story and you want to use the data to back up the story, or you can decide to keep that data private because you haven't released the story or your investigation is still ongoing. Your dashboard shows you the status of all the requests that you have. It shows you things that you can do that day, for example, classify requests to say whether you've got the information or you haven't got the information. And it also reminds you of other things that you might be able to do to move your investigation forward. The key feature that we found is most useful to journalists in the UK has been the batch feature. So we have implemented this feature, which allows people to select up to 500 authorities within What Do They Know? And they can make the same single request to all of those authorities. That's been a game changer for quite a lot of the journalists that we work with, because basically it means that they're not typing out the same request over and over and over again and then getting each reply back in like one at a time into their email account. All of the requests and replies are put into one place, which you can see on your dashboard. It shows you a status bar to say how many requests are awaiting a response, how many have been denied, and how many are complete. So when you go through and do the classification of each request, that helps the status bar grow. We have some new features that we are going to be adding that we're testing at the moment. One of them is something called a projects feature, which I don't have any slides of at the moment, but it is a really interesting and really useful feature which helps you analyze the data that comes out of those batch requests. So You may, for example, if you're making a batch request to local authorities about spending on social housing, for example, you may get a lot of responses back that the data's displayed in different ways in the responses. What Projects allows you to do is to put all of those batch requests into one place, set up a brief of what you want people to do, and then get volunteers on board to help you classify the requests and draw the data out of the responses. And then when the data has been drawn out of the responses, it can be compiled into a spreadsheet by the project's feature. And then you can just download the spreadsheet and you'll have the data basically in the answers to your questions in a really simple and easy to understand format. So that's one key feature that we are testing at the moment with journalist users, and we're hoping to roll out much further very soon. So that's a whistle-stop tour of what do they know. How FOI works in the UK. You can request information from any public authority or publicly funded body in the UK under our FOI Act. So this does include, unlike the USA it seems, government departments, devolved administrations. So for example, Scotland, Northern Ireland or Wales, the national assemblies and governments there. Other publicly funded bodies, so for example, the BBC and the NHS, and committees. You can request from local councils. Schools tend to be able to request it from, same with universities, those are private institutions, so they don't always answer, but generally because it's a public service and education is a publicly funded department, then they do have more of an obligation to answer. Our National Health Service, like I said, publicly owned companies, museums, galleries and theatres, our police and fire service, although there are many exemptions applying to the police, and in Scotland, registered social landlords. So these are people that get funding from local councils or local authorities in the UK to provide housing for what we termed council tenants, so people who need support in housing. You can request any kind of recorded information. This has recently also been widened to social media and WhatsApp correspondence, so not just email. That was widened out, I think, in the past 2 years. And you can also request the recorded opinion of a public figure, so like an MP or a government official. As we are in Europe, we also have the Environmental Regulations Act. So sometimes information that you might request that is related to the environment will be covered under EIR law instead of the FOI law. In the UK, you don't have to specify which act you're requesting information under. The authorities have to make the decision themselves and then respond. But in Northern Ireland and in Ireland itself, that's different. You have to specify which law you're requesting the information under, which is confusing to a lot of people because many people don't know what the EIR covers and what the FOI Act covers. Obviously, you can't request personal information or information relating to yourself. Those are covered under subject access requests. And we always tell people, like, do a Google search first, because there is a lot of proactive release of data from authorities, because the government has made a big push to encourage authorities, local authorities and public bodies to proactively release information, mainly, I think, to cut down on the amount of work that FOI requests brings in. Authorities in the UK have 20 working days to respond to your request. If they do not respond within this time, you can send them a reminder. And if they then continue not to respond, then you can request an internal review or take your complaint to the ICO, which is our Information Commissioner's Office, who are the ombudsman who kind of look after FOI in the UK. The ICO are, though they do have FOI as a remit for them, they are also an authority that covers data protection, and data protection is higher funded than FOI is. So the amount of effort that goes into responding to reports of data breaches, complaints and things like that around FOI versus responding to kind of data protection issues is, yeah, that differs a lot. And we do find that though the ICO and us have a good working relationship, and they often have a good working relationship with public bodies, it takes quite a long time to get a ruling from them, unfortunately. So you don't always get the information that you ask for. There are exemptions, there are quite a lot of them. We are putting some work at the moment into explaining and allowing you to select the exemption that your FOI request has been denied under, to help people when they are requesting an internal review or escalating something to the ICO or the courts. We're putting that into What Do They Know at the moment, and we're hoping to be able to release that within the next couple of months. So soon people will be able to see like a feature within their What Do They Know profile that will allow them to say this FOI request has been rejected under whatever exemption it is, and then they can use that to then take a case to the ICO. We do have a public interest test that is applied quite often, actually, and if they decide that it's not in the public interest to release the information, they have to declare why and explain why. And often then, if that is taken to an internal review or the ICO, sometimes those can get overruled. So that's quite useful. However, we do have a problem with requests that are considered vexatious, or in some cases, requests that ask for too much information in one go. And there is a cost limit to the amount of time that authorities have to spend on compiling information that responds to your FOI request. So they are able to therefore reply and say, this will be outside of the cost limit. You will have to pay a charge if you want to get this information. And if you decide to pay the charge, then they will then go and compile the information. But more often than not, people will not pay the charges. Therefore, the information doesn't get released. And there are some notable examples of authorities within the UK deliberately counting numerous FOI requests on similar subjects by the same people as one single request, and then using that to deny the information to those people. But let's talk about some successes, some case studies that we have of the use of What Do They Know by journalists. So this was a big scandal that happened in our social housing and council property sector in 2017. FOI was used to basically prevent a local council in London from selling off a large part of its property portfolio, which then would have been demolished and rebuilt by a large developer, which sounds fine. But the problem is that in the UK, and especially in London, our housing laws state that only a certain percentage of new housing that gets built has to be designated to social tenants. That's supposed to prevent developers from, for example, building new tower blocks, selling off flats to people with lots of money who then don't live in them, and is supposed to essentially protect social housing. But when you're demolishing social housing to build tower blocks that then wouldn't be social housing, you're actually evicting a lot of people for no reason. So we saw the Bureau Local link up with a residents group in Haringey to use FOI to basically request a lot of information about the developers, about the local council's involvement, and about what the actual plans were. So planning is quite a big one that gets requested a lot under FOI in the UK, like things relating to planning. So this was one where we had a huge success. A lot of the people said that they'd never submitted an FOI request before, but using the What Do They Know service made it super easy, because you don't have to know anything apart from what information you want to request. You just have to know the authority and the information you want to request, and it's a template form. You can just fill in with your request and send it off, and it gives you a unique email address, so that the authority just has to hit reply, and the response is automatically given to you, to the email address that you sign up for your account with, and also posted publicly on the site. And also the responses to the FOIs that they did get, because there was so much detail coming in from loads of different parties, from the media, from everything, the FOI responses that they were getting were helping them focus the key set of facts that they needed to actually fight in court to stop this development happening. And in the end, they were successful, and the tower blocks still stand and the social residents still live there, which is a really good success for us. Another successful investigation run by the Bureau of Investigative Journalism in the UK was something called Sold From Under You. Again, similar kind of thing to the previous case. This was looking at kind of public spaces like leisure spaces, community hubs, things that successive governments in the UK have been making spending cuts to for years, for over 10 years now. And so local councils are running at a deficit, and they are selling off spaces which the community have used for years to provide essential community services, care services, like parent and baby groups, sports facilities, that kind of thing. They're selling them off because they need to make money. And this is one way they can see to do it, because they don't have the funds to provide those services anymore. But the communities aren't really getting the information that this is going to happen until it happens. So they used FOIs to get information about what was actually going to be sold. They did this in Bristol's one of the areas that they looked at, and they mapped on a map using the results from the FOI request exactly where all of the council properties that had been sold off or that were going to be sold off were, just to show people just how many there were and exactly what the council was doing. And so the other thing I just wanted to mention really quickly is, obviously I said right at the start, Abraji is an open source platform. It runs on Ruby on Rails, and it is deployed in many different places around the world. So we have 20 plus languages, 25 plus jurisdictions. There are also other platforms which are inspired by Abraji, but are not running on the Abraji software. The two most notable of those are the Freude platform, which is running Frag den Staat in Germany and in Austria, and the Muckrock platform in the USA. This is just a screenshot of some of the places where our sites are running at the moment. You see the Transparency Belgium site has Abraji Pro banner underneath it. We are involved in a project at the moment supported by the Odessian Foundation and the Swedish Postcode Foundation to roll out the Pro features to a number of sites in Europe to essentially help spark more use of FOI in media investigations and campaigns across Europe. And I just wanted to say there was a Brazilian Alavatelli, as you can see in 2012, Transparency, a hacker, talked to us about launching Queremos Saber. But unfortunately, by 2015, it had to shut down because the law in Brazil, we were told by the guys that were running the site, did not allow for FOI via email. And that is the main thing that Alavatelli does. It submits FOI via email requests. So the platform unfortunately failed there. But yeah. That is the end.
Muito obrigada, Jen.
Thank you very much, Jen. Those are very interesting ideas. Quite a powerful tool that you've developed. I have many ideas I want to steal from you. So it's very important for us to have these tools that make our lives easier. Let us now close our presentation for today with a national product, Luiz Fernando Toledo, one of the most productive reporters for information access here in Brazil, one of the directors of Abraji. He founded Fiquem Sabendo, Get to Know, in a literal translation, which distributes databases and requests of information that they receive through a newsletter, which is distributed to over 5,000 people. They use Reuters and University of Oxford, University of Journalism, is going to show a result of an Abraji survey with the use of these with journalists in Brazil. Is going to share where we stand in Brazil. Please, Luiz Toledo. I apologize, my mic was off. Now I think I'm on. Can you see my presentation? Yeah, you're good. So before anything else, I would like to thank you all. I'm very glad to be able to discuss with you all our law of access to information, LAI in Portuguese. It seems that our issues are similar in our solutions as well. So I've seen excellent examples of the FOIA, the RTI, we can call it many names in different countries. We've also seen the tools that journalists use, and we see the worst issues that we face. Abraji has the 4th issue of this survey. So it's a survey that we produce, and it shows us specifically what are the difficulties that journalists face through the LAI. So it's interesting because many of the things I'm going to say here, I'm going to present to you, has been said. And the problems are similar. One thing that it's very necessary, we had a record of over 400 people that wanted to be part of the survey because we wanted to see in other parts, they wanted to focus through email with journalists. We wanted to have people that never use the law to access information. And so what's the size of this universe where we have to expand? Maybe we have more people that are now in a context. And it's 9 years old. We know the law exists. People don't even know, actually. It's a law for journalists, a law for few. And many of them are investigative journalists, but it's fundamental that Abraji we want the tools to be ready. We want more and more journalists and more journalists to use it. So the first question is, have you ever requested? So the answer is not if the person is used to use the LAI. In Portuguese, again, LAI is our law. Have you ever used LAI? And even if it's a survey, and people tend to have an interest. About half of them have never ever requested through the LAI. The age group of the people who don't use, the number of times, so the age group that uses the most is between 40 and 49 years old, which is rather interesting in our opinion. I believe that investigative journalists in Brazil are usually younger, up to 49 years old. This is why they use the most. So, and we have divided into more generic characteristics. We know Brazil is very complex. We know that many organizations, civilian, military, in different institutions and agencies, many times people don't know where to send the question, don't know how to answer the question, which is the department in charge for that information. So the difficulty of using the law ends up making many people to actually use the LAI. So we have different types of works. There's a question if they use for press use, and people say, what's the difference of requesting LAI or make a request to a newsroom? So that's an argument that they use very interesting, because many people have never used that. It's interesting that you have a concentration of people who have never used LAI. You have a concentrated use of the law to access information, people which work with multimedia. We have many journalists which already started their career. I believe that it can allow this kind of action because they can have more space for data, for infographics, for documents. So multimedia is a means that the journalists can obtain through this survey. The LAI focus is towards the executive branch. All the reports, just about all reports, come to the same areas. You see, just the data with the federal government executive branch. You can go to Abraji if you want more detailed information, but states, municipalities are pretty much similar. So the focus is the executive branch, legislative, judiciary, and the prosecution office. Many people are looking for less, but it's interesting to see that the way in which the political system works in Brazil, how things work, you end up having more information towards the executive to analyze policy making. It's where journalism is always harder. But at the same time, we say that because they're very used, people see less issues. We have another piece of data that shows the executive is where journalists have identified the most difficulties for access to information. It means executive is worse. No, it's because it's where people ask for more requests and they end up looking or finding more issues than in other cases. Many examples of lack of transparency in the legislature or the judiciary, but there's not as much as looked for as the executive. Next question. What is the most frequent problem that you found in your requests? Closed format information, PDF. Many times they need a spreadsheet or even the crude data. But this information usually comes in PDF, a non-editable PDF. So if you have like the screenshot of a document, which is very common to happen in Brazil, you have to write in hand or type everything, put in a spreadsheet, and you might even take longer than you can and you miss timing. Second one is undue secrecy. They're not as specific, but many times not just what is in the law is respected. We have lots of use of undue secrecy because they say without giving information, and that would allow the request with the resource complaining. And what's most common is that information does not correspond to what's requested. You ask for apple and they give you a banana. You know, some people forget or they give up the requests all in all because the information they needed never came and they end up using the tool at all because they get fed up with it. There's another one, which is that basically you're asking for information that the agency thinks it's not easy to get, that they will have to gather lots of documents, it's too troublesome, that they're going to go for several entities to compile the information you're asking. So they're not ready. And that's their main argument. And it's not really additional work. It's to open a drawer, for instance, sending on this information to a computer and so on. The law is not very clear. So it's also a negative that's very generic. And the last item is there, answer in undue time, meaning out of the legal time frame. But I've seen a case a year, 2 years. Nate has mentioned 15, 16 years. Imagine that. But the question is about, have you ever had difficulties to receive replies to your requests during the pandemic? Yes, is the darkest gray. Over half of the people, they did have issues in having access to information during the pandemic. And the reasons are the most diverse. Some of them, they say it's telework, they're doing work from home. Now, negatives, because of the negative, why have they not given the answer to the request? So once again, they say generically 73% because of the pandemic. This is why I'm not giving you the information you're requesting. They wanted things to not go on because during a moment of crisis, of a sanitary urgency, would be even more necessary that access to public information be disseminated. So that's not a good of an answer. That's not good of a reasoning. They also said, similar to a decree, because there's a decree in Brazil that says the LAI may have a few more waivers because of situations that are urgent, but they use the pandemic as an urgent argument. But you know, we're working to save lives, so we can't give you LAI requests. Imagine that. So this is to be discussed. Are they really prevented because they're working in the pandemic? Because information is important, to fight the pandemic is important, but we have to know on the side of the society how they are fighting the pandemic, how much they are spending, if we have enough beds or not. So the law of information is even more important. And we heard a lot that they changed the staff. So with the change in staff, the person did not know where the paperwork was. And finally, we asked the journalists to put suggestions how they wanted to improve the law in Brazil. I'm not going to read every case, but the report is full, and it is interesting because I see that journalists have matured. They have understood better what the law is all about and what they need and can get. And so today, the government itself has improved a few things after the suggestions. Actually, they've been incorporated in the system. It's very good because one of the best things that we have in Brazil nowadays is that the very federal government allows that every request ever to be listed in an online repository. All requests from beginning to end in a database, states, municipalities, federal government. It's like all requests. It's a platform. In the federal government, they did this anyways, but now it's in 3 levels because people don't have to request twice. So just look up if your request has been asked and you'll see if that has been requested yet. So there's other suggestions as well, like in Brazil, some people don't have even internet connection. So you can only imagine what this can result. Creation of databases, but this is already assisted. States and municipalities find it harder to respond. It would be interesting to have all of them online. There's a tool called SEI, Electronic Information System. It's like a repository of all public documents from federal agencies. And this make it much easier to publicize or to make public policies. This tool needs to be improved because few agencies have this available. Also, what they call is application of precedents. Like people go with all the requests from beginning to end. They do the appeal. They take to court. And the decision is kind of lost in the way. People ask the same very request because they don't know this has been requested before. Sometimes equal requests. One is turned out as a yes, the other one is turned out as a no. Believe it or not. So some journalists have given up using the tool. Also, second issue is to do with inspection or enforcement itself, or in terms of auditing. You know, auditing is very important. They have even requested to create like an LAI prosecution office to institutionalize the enforcement by other agencies. It's a bit of what Nate said about the strong backing agent. In this sense, there's a famous website in Brazil, which is called Reclame Aqui in Portuguese, meaning complain here in the literal translation. It's a channel to denounce, to make denunciations. So the idea is wonderful, actually. Anyone can go and see. And finally, this is where Abraji goes in more strongly, which is to have more communication, more publication on the advantages of the Brazilian LAI, workshops, speeches, lectures, online, everywhere, and also create what we call population participation councils. The people would become inspectors themselves. They would become watchdogs themselves, the population. LAI has up to 30 days as a final term to receive the information. Sometimes they give the information in the due time in 30 days, but it's not what they requested, you know? So the process has to start all over. If there was a quick communication channel between those who are asking, those who are responding with a simple email or call, we would then have some productive responses and more useful to journalists. And finally, closing with 2 sentences of people who were interviewed, including Marina. She's here with us for the report. Good journalism has never settled with obstacled access to information. Marcelo Beraba, it's a famous journalist in Brazil, one of the founders of Abraji. LAI is a great show of how important it is to act with the civil society around a common purpose. Marina said that. Here, she's with us, saying how the LAI was approved in Brazil and how we have many organizations fighting for the organization to exist. Today, many of these organizations are fighting for the law to work. Abraji, Transparência Brazil, Article 19, Fiquem Sabendo, all of them make the law a dream come true, so that data are actually taken for people. They know the advantages of using the LAI in Brazil for having eyes on the public authority. And journalism can be seen as something serious. I'm done. Excellent. Thank you, Luiz. Wonderful insights on the use of LAI in the Brazilian acronym. We have like galore of questions here. Many people asking. Let me try and prioritize a few and group these questions so I can ask them and how LAI or RTI and FOI are included. Nate, a first question for you. Maybe Shyamlal and Jen can also speak after Nate answers, because we want to know what you guys think in India and the UK, okay? Here goes.
Yeah, tell.
So Nate, you as a person who gives instructions to reporters on how to best use the FOI, what's their most difficulty of journalists in the US, how to use the law in the US? And is FOIA taught in journalism schools in the US?
Sure. Yep. I would say it's absolutely taught in journalism schools. Despite the law's flaws that we've talked about a little bit, and how I'm jealous of some of my colleagues' laws in some aspects compared to the US law. In general, we're still very proud of it. There are still senators in the legislative branch and representatives that work to make it stronger. So it's absolutely taught in journalist schools. Most reporters know it pretty well, fairly well. the biggest challenge I would say, in addition to delays in not redaction, I would say, I'll add one more, is reporters generally, they want everything instead of targeting a request that's very specific for a specific record that's easily identifiable for the reporter and the agency. If a person does that, they're much more likely to get the record quickly and probably with less redactions. So sometimes a reporter, for example, might just want only one email or one contract, but they get a little bit greedy and they decide, oh, I'll ask for 1,000 emails and contracts that might be related. It would be better just to ask for that one. And then maybe you can do a second request for the 1,000 after. But in general, you want to be as targeted as possible.
Paciência é uma coisa difícil de ensinar para repórter. E é uma coisa
Well,
que
patience and specificity is difficult to teach reporters, I guess. So, Shyamlal, what are the difficulties that journalists face in India to use, like charging? Is it a difficulty to charge for a request?
No, I'm telling you, in fact, ordinary RTI users, they have a lot of difficulties because in last around 15 years, at least 84 RTI users have been killed. Okay, but not the journalists. Like one question was for me that do you face any retaliation, this, that. So I didn't face so far because I am placed with a prominent media organization, which is very powerful organization in India. Earlier also, I was with a magazine, which is prominent and very powerful. So I didn't face any difficulty, but the users at the grassroots level, in the state capitals, in the districts, they are facing difficulties. But as far as journalists are concerned, I am telling you, in India, journalists, I'm not saying every journalist, but most of the journalists are not using the RTI. They, in fact, depend on RTI activists, NGOs, and some independent users. They get the information and then they supply to the journalists. Because by the time journalists or users have learned how to use RTI, the same time the officers, government officers, they have learned how to decline the information using same provisions. Okay, so since there are no penalties, etc., imposed, so they don't provide information within 30 days, which is the prescribed time limit. Lot of difficulties are there, but journalists are little lazy. They are not filing RTI. If they keep file, like I told you, I filed 10,000 applications, but I didn't get 10,000 stories. So if my 10 applications are being denied, and after that I am getting one good story after that, what online filing RTI, what gets one application? Just 10 rupees and 2 minutes time. Okay. So I request journalists in India also, and wherever journalists are using RTI, they must keep filing, and they will get maybe rejection on 10 applications, but 11th application may turn into a good story. So we must be persistent. We must keep filing. Only then we can make this law effective and our work relevant also.
Genial. A Jen comentou da dificuldade do processo mesmo.
Jen, you mentioned about the difficulty of the process. So in your case, Jen, would you say any other difficulties specifically other than what you already spoke in the UK, Jen?
In terms of difficulties that journalists face in getting information, I was just trying to think if there was anything specific from the ones that we've worked with. I'll post if something comes into my head, but at the moment I can't think of anything that I haven't already mentioned. It's usually around kind of taking things to court or taking things to the ICO if they get rejection.
Agora eu estou com inveja dos jornalistas. Agora eu fiquei com inveja dos jornalistas britânicos.
I'm jealous of the
I
British
envy
journalists
UK
now.
journalists now.
Going back to what journalists can ask for or not, because here, sometimes, really sometimes, we have access to diplomatic telegrams, for instance, of the Brazilian embassies abroad. And I would like to know from you, this is a question from the audience, if a Brazilian journalist, for instance, would receive responses, if we could apply, for instance, in the United States, if we could ask for diplomatic communications in the United States, in India, or in the UK. Actually, I think we can file the request, but will we receive an answer back or not? Nate, you go first.
Sure. Yes, the answer is yes. One success story was when COVID began, we filed a request for US diplomatic cables from Wuhan, China, about the Institute of Virology before COVID hit, about this possible theory that it escaped from the lab. And the cables were released and we did a story about them. So that's one example of a diplomatic cable being released. Of course, I must say that the more recent the cable, the more likely there's national security exemptions or other exemptions. But yes, an American or any person, including you, can file for diplomatic cables and you will get them. You have to use aggressive tactics like we spoke about usually, but yes.
I can tell you about India. It is in fact exempted. The information which is related to relations between two countries, with India and another country, so it is already exempted in the RTI Act, so they don't provide such information.
In the UK, you definitely would be able to ask. It may fall under an exemption of national security if they decide that it is relating to national security. But in general, correspondence between, and actually there was a recent government story about Priti Patel and a trip to Israel that was funded by someone in Netanyahu's government, that the correspondence between them, the private correspondence between them, was released. So, you know, you can ask for that information. It will be decided based on like whether they think it's national security, but yeah. And anyone outside the UK can file a request. In the UK, we don't have any problems with that. There was a recent ruling by the ICO actually to basically state that yes, that was still okay after we left the EU, because obviously that threw up some problems.
Isso é bem importante, tem esse efeito Brexit também sobre...
That's important, this Brexit effect on the FOIA. Another question specifically for Nate, and it's a personal curiosity of mine as well. I asked the audience, the person who asked this, what is the importance of having somebody like you in-house? Is this common in other vehicles in the United States as well? So how common is it?
I think not common enough. I mean, I think I am biased, but I think it's very important. Just to be, reporters at the Washington Post are very good at FOIA, but just to have me on top of all of the latest trends or knowing what type of requests have worked in another instance, so to replicate them and sharing that information. And just if there's a roadblock, maybe if an agency is delaying, they will come to me and I'll say, okay, well, we'll try A, B, and C to try and break the roadblock. It's very important. And also to have a way to, as Jen talked about, tracking requests is quite difficult. And we are also working on a way to track requests, know when to file an appeal, etc. And then also I'll just mention that in many instances, in the US context at least, it's important to be at a news organization like I'm very grateful to be at, that's not afraid to litigate FOIA. I'll just mention one more quick success story, the Afghanistan papers. There were thousands of pages of secret interviews about the Afghanistan war by US generals. And they used these papers to make a report that was very sterile government report. But in the footnotes to the report, it mentioned these interviews. And we filed a FOIA for the interviews, but could not get them. And then we sued and we got them. And it showed that these generals in private in these interviews were saying things they weren't saying publicly. And essentially in many cases that they knew the US was losing the war, but would say that privately, but not to the public. But we never would have gotten that had we not filed a lawsuit and paid lawyers to sue. So that's also important too. One final coda is that in the US, generally, if your lawyers win the lawsuit, the government has to pay your lawyers. So that's one more good thing about the US law.
Muito bom. Bom, fiquem sabendo, tem...
Great to hear that. There's a practice of taking this to courts or even for external control agencies that like we have here in Brazil. Another question. We have a question for all of you. What are, in each of your countries, the reasons that are usually used to deny access to some sort of information or to hamper access to information to journalists? Let's start with Jen this time.
So tactics used to delay and hamper access to journalists. Exemptions mainly are the things that I think are used, but there's, and like I said, the case of where people were submitting very similar requests. This is less journalists, but more campaigners, very similar requests about the same thing to the same organization. So one example was when Privacy International were doing an investigation into social media monitoring by the police. And they were running a campaign and asking people to submit requests to the police authorities, like their local police authorities and the overarching police authority in the UK, about their use of social media monitoring. And they tried to bundle all of those requests into one request and then say that that was too big to answer and it would cost too much and take too long, so they didn't have to answer. So those kind of things have to be kind of taken to the ICO and taken to court. But there aren't many stumbling blocks in the way, not in the same way that we've seen in other places. Like, for example, I know from our work with the Netherlands that you have to state whether you're a journalist or not. When you request information, you have to state what the information is going to be used for and if it's going to be for commercial purposes. Like the UK has nothing like that. So we don't have, our FOI law is quite good, and the way that the public bodies react to it is quite good as well.
Shyamlal?
Yeah, in fact, my experience is that they can deny any information which they don't want to give you. Okay, in 15 years, they have learned how to decline the information. They can interpret the same RTI law and decline you the information. You may get after the appeal, after second appeal in the Information Commission, but the information which is relevant today, you are getting after 2 years. So it will be useless for you as a journalist. So this is happening. So what I do, I keep filing whenever I get some idea, get some tip off from the department. I file, other journalists also file. So in same department, there are different officials who are posted at public information officers. So one officer denies, other officer can provide. So that we just keep taking chances and getting the information. But there are a number of denials, and though the information denial exemptions are very clear that that is personal information that affects relations between two countries, that the case is under investigation. So those are the exemptions there. But they can interpret any information under investigation. Okay, any information which they can say that it will affect the national security. So you can be denied with any information, but there are, as I told you, we have a vast country. We have 28 states and 8 union territories, apart from the large central government, other government offices. So what I do, I always keep trying getting ideas from new offices, new ideas, new stories. So that is how I'm keeping my work alive and relevant. So that is the fact. Otherwise, they can deny anything which they don't want to give you.
Sure, I'll quickly say that maybe some good news. The most commonly cited exemption in the US is for personal privacy. So that's a person's address or something. The US law says that you must segregate that. So often you get a full page, but only the address is blacked out. So that's the statistically number one. Also, the way that you fight this and others, if it's inappropriate, is to always write an administrative appeal. At least more than 1/3 of all appeals end up the requester wins more information. And an appeal is not a lawyer, it's just writing a letter. So I tell everyone, always appeal.
Acho que as experiências do Shyamlal e do Nate
experiences from Nate and Shyamlal, they complement each other. The excessive use of exemptions and the need of insisting through appeals. And Luiz mentioned his experience, and I'd like to ask him to say, how can we avoid these difficulties? How can we bypass these denials that are so common in Brazil as well? It's a good practice to be very precise and very concise in the application because we're trying to anticipate the denials. But still, I like to elaborate on my requests. I go to our database, I check if the information was already denied or not, and this database makes us more humble because we usually think we have a brilliant idea, and when we take a look at the database, we see, oh, 100 people asked the same thing. And when I see the denial, I know I can't ask this or that. So if they say this is classified, if the information, if they say, oh, we have a lot of work to do to obtain that information for you, it's very costly, I'll ask them if that's the answer that they give me, then I'll say, okay, so what type of work would have to be done by the government to have access to that information? So the main thing is to try to study what was already done. And if it's unprecedented, you should try to include in the question these possible barriers. Why is this information classified? What would be the additional workload for the government to provide this type of information? There are other cases that explain how many hours would be considered additional working hours for a person to obtain that information. I think your audio isn't working in the Portuguese channel, it seems. I think there's a problem with the Portuguese channel, it seems. People aren't hearing you. Testing, can you hear me? Is the sound working in Portuguese or not?
Oi, teste. Estão me ouvindo?
Aparentemente, agora foi.
I think it's working now. It's working in Portuguese. Just to conclude, these are the two main things. Take a look at the previously asked questions and the precedents, the decisions that were made in the past by people who complained about it, and then there was a favorable decision on their behalf. For instance, the same thing you would do in a court case. You would take a look at the case law, precedents from the court so that you can back up your arguments. if you don't insist, it's hard. We don't want to discourage anybody, but you have to have patience and you have to plan for that. Because sometimes you file a lot of requests and then you expect your Christmas presents to come in so you can open them. I'd like you to speak very briefly, because we're almost out of time. Talk to the journalists to give them some encouragement. What do you like about working with FOIA as journalists? What does this add to the journalism work? I'll start with Jen once again.
Sorry, could you repeat that for me?
Claro. O uso da lei de acesso à
The
informação.
use of FOIA, what does it add in terms of value, in terms of relevance for work as a journalist?
This is one of the key things that we are working out at the moment. The biggest thing for us is data. It helps back up a story. So when data is released publicly on the Alavatelli site and the journalists kind of deprivatize their requests, then you can point people at the data source and say, you know, this is the story I've written, and here is the data to back up why, like, this is happening, like why this is true, what, like, where it all comes from, that kind of stuff. That's the biggest thing that we found. But also it adds nuance and detail to stories as well. So you can get the kind of the personal stories of people, and then you can contrast them against a wider backdrop of data-based information. So for example, in some of the stories that we've seen that have been released, especially around community-based things, we can say, you know, like, we can see journalists have gone and spoken to specific, like, individuals within a community, but then they've requested data from local authorities across the whole of the UK, and they've used that data to say, you know, this is happening, these are the personal stories of people, but here's how it affects everyone in the UK. And we might not have all those personal stories, but we have the data to back up, you know, why this is happening. So those are the things that we've found people have said are most useful.
Muito obrigada. Shyamlal?
Thank you. Shyamlal?
Yeah, it has given more value to the journalists. In fact, if we look back to the journalism of 20 years back, it's in India, everything even in government, public policy, and the media is called pre-RTI and post-RTI. Okay, so the information which was a privileged information, a journalist cannot even think of that, getting that information from the government offices before the RTI Act. And now you have the right, you are asking, you are getting the information. But what I would request everybody, RTI Act is for ordinary citizens in India also and abroad also. And it is not any specific law for the journalists. But only the journalists can use it better. They only can make some impact. You must have seen in India, I am seeing there are millions of applications being filed every year, but mostly they are very, very minor issues related to common man. But as a journalist, we always watch to the government offices. We are aware what is, we have some tip of that what is happening inside the government offices. So we can keep asking for the information. Only then, like that, I quoted UK Prime Minister, former Prime Minister. I think if journalists uses RTI Act, so every Prime Minister will think like that, like Mr. Tony Blair. So, but we must keep thinking new ideas. We must keep filing, and it has given more value to journalism, more the stories which if we read our archives of 20 years back before RTI Act, the information which the stories we will now think it is not a story because it is obvious in the public domain. That is the impact of RTI Act. So it has given more power to citizens, more power to journalists. So we must keep using that. That is my request to everybody.
Luiz?
Bom, acho que eu queria só complementar tudo que já foi
I'd
falado.
just like to add, this fits into the Brazilian context. I'd like to talk about a possible contradiction that exists in the law. Journalists always want an exclusive information. They want exclusivity of the information. They think and the law of access to information, it creates a different type of culture, a culture of sharing information being available for more people, and more people will be able to use this information for their work. And for the law to work, if you need to have more people asking for information, and this mass of journalists and people who use the law, this will create pressure on the government because the government won't be able to deny information if a lot of people start asking. And we have had cases during the pandemic of attempts of going back, of trying to go back to what it was before the law. But we have civil society organizations that were able to maintain the law in place because of public pressure. I know it's important for journalism to have exclusivity on information, but when we say that we're using the law in a text, it might make a difference because other people might use our example to do their own work or simply make some information available so that anybody who wants to inspect something, to monitor something, to conduct research with that information, so they can also have access to this. It's something very beautiful that is provided by the law because we strengthen collaborative journalism where we're at the center, but we are collaborating with other media and with other stakeholders so that the information becomes public, so that data, so that the documents, so that the public policies behind those documents also become very clear to everybody.
My final quick advice to journalists on why you should use these laws is because getting a document is more difficult than getting a soundbite or getting an interview or getting someone to show you something. Think about how powerful your story is when you say a document released by FOIA shows, and then maybe you put a nice, beautiful picture of that document with redactions right on the image, like Shyamlal showed his, because records often are stronger than everything else. And like we talked about, it's very difficult business. Maybe you only get 1 out of 3 or 1 out of 5 or 1 out of 10. But when you get that document and you can say records released under Right to Information Act show, that is really a great feeling. So when you're feeling down and you get the rejections and you have to appeal, think about how good it feels when you could splash that declassified document right on your story.
Sim, é ótimo sentimento mesmo.
It is a great feeling, really. Unfortunately, we will have to wrap up our chat for today because we have gone beyond our time. I'd like to thank you very much for your support, the support of the U.S. Embassy in Brazil and also the British diplomatic mission. Thank you to the translators for their work. And obviously, I'd like to thank Nate, Shyamlal, Luiz, and Jen for dedicating some of their precious time and their experience and sharing this experience with us today. It was very inspiring. And lastly, but not less important, I'd like to thank the audience, all of those who were with us until now. You all sent your questions. We were unable to cover all of them, unfortunately, in spite of the fact that we are having an inquiry commission in Parliament right now talking about the COVID crisis. But I encourage you to continue working. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Namaste. Bye.